Exposing the Expositions. Narrated by author Howdy McCoskey. Chapter 2. World Fair Origins. Quote, "The first step in liquidating a people is to erase its memory. Destroy its books, its culture, its history. Then have somebody write new books, manufacture a new culture, invent a new history. Before long, that nation will begin to forget what it is and what it was. The world around it will forget even faster." Milan Kundera, The Book of Laughter and Forgetting. World Expositions are now sanctioned by the Bureau International des Expositions in Paris. Their website has a listing of all major world expos, as well as a few photos of many of them. But to really examine them, one must expand the research investigation. The Study Love site of John Paul Sanks is a great source for finding much out there that is available on these events, with links to original photographs, articles, and books. An interesting source for Chicago I've come across is The Book of the Fair by Hubert Howe Bancroft. It is 1,500 pages of information, published in 1895, just after the exposition concluded, so as to provide the message of the times. I will examine Bancroft later, for he is as much a part of the writing as the writing itself. Each of the major expositions had their own historian to write a massive document of not just the event itself, but the entire world history leading up to them. It is almost to me, as in the Kundera quote above, these historical books are not so much presenting history as presenting the history of those in command want everyone to believe. Bancroft begins his book with a long examination of commerce and trade in Egypt, and specifically Phoenicia, and claims these gatherings were always held as sacred places, my emphasis, and of how the ancient Greeks held adjoining fairs for the Olympics at Delphi. When it comes to fairs thousands of years in the past, he describes, "In the majority of instances, the ancient fairs were established in connection with religious festivals, and hence were held within or near some place of worship or on some sacred spot, as around the shrine of a martyr or the tomb of a saint. At first, these gatherings were purely for devotional purposes, but presently a certain business was transacted into provisions, the demand for which increased with the influx of worshippers. Then came the idea of profiting by this traffic, followed by the attendance of merchants who offered for sale a variety of wares. In 1893, the organizers wanted to lay claim that the current exhibitions were somehow direct descendants of this ancient world. The underlying message being presented was that the ancient fairs were held at sacred spots. So, should the place that the expositions occurred in Philadelphia, New York, Chicago, or Paris be thought of as sacred spots? Not because a fair took place there, but because they were already sacred somehow prior, and that is why the fair was placed there. Basic history claims that what became the modern great fairs evolved from local English and French fairs of the 1700s, which were a sort of combined business exhibit and public entertainment for the local area. Bancroft's look at French fairs is very telling. For after mentioning the fairs at Lyon and Saint Denis, granted to the monks by Dagobert, he then mentions two locations, Champagne and Troyes. These are the two French sites that are most connected with the stories of the Holy Grail and with the Knights Templar, whose charter came at Troyes. This is an interesting thing to consider. The early French fairs are linked with the two most mysterious concepts of the last 1,000 years. While the first overall large fair happened at the end of the 1700s in Prague as part of the coronation of Leopold II as King of Bohemia in 1797, it was an exposition the next year, 1798 in Paris, that was special. Current history still claims that the first world-sanctioned fair happened in England in 1851, but this is untrue. The first one worthy of the name, though lasting for only 3 days with only 110 exhibitors, was the Temple of Industry, erected by Napoleon in 1798 in the Champ de Mars. Napoleon was at the forefront of these early fairs, for he was often off capturing Egypt at the time, and kept them going once he became emperor. That they came just 10 years after the start of the French Revolution may reveal a hidden reasoning for these original fairs. The time of the Revolution had great festivals, such as the Festival of Law in 1792, or the Festival of the Supreme Being in 1794, and there was a need to revise the history of France to suit its purposes. The Great Exposition. I'll repeat that. The Great Exhibition of the works of industry of all nations, or thankfully shortened to the Great Exhibition, was held in Hyde Park, London, May 1 to October 15, 1851. Joseph Paxton, a gardener and greenhouse builder, won the contract to build the main building for the fair and was assisted by railroad builders. Basically, what they came up with was a massive glass and iron building that earned the nickname the Crystal Palace. It was 1,851 feet long to correspond with the year of the fair, 450 feet wide, and required 900,000 square feet of glass and 3,300 iron columns. He modeled it on the leaf of the African water lily. It is claimed to have been completed in 9 months, but of course there's no photographic record of this. What we do have is the drawings and the photos of the building itself. It was enormous and contained over 13,000 exhibits for the fair, but there was more. It had Egyptian temples, Babylonian temples, thousands of Roman and Greek statues, concert halls, and giant trees to make it feel as if you were outdoors. What I found very interesting was a speech given by Prince Albert in 1851 at a banquet given by the Mayor of London. He said, "Nobody who has paid any attention to the particular features of our present era will doubt for a moment that we are living in a period of most wonderful transition, which tends rapidly to accomplish that great end to which all history points, the realization of the unity of mankind, not a unity which breaks down the limits and levels the peculiar characteristics of the different nations of the earth, but rather a unity, the results and products of these very national varieties and antagonistic qualities." End quote. The two parts that strike me most of this excerpt is first the mention that progress comes from national and antagonistic qualities, hence warfare and conquest, exactly what the British and other European nations were doing at the time. The second is the mention of the time being a period of transition. I think this is a veiled statement to what was really going on. A transition was happening worldwide between 1800 and 1900, and seems almost as if 1850 was some sort of marker. So much of any invention now that is a part of our world somehow has its origin of finding, inventing, and understanding happening after 1850. It's amazing once you begin to look for it. So the fact that the fair took place in 1851 is indeed telling. Back to the Crystal Palace. An amazing 6 million people, around 1/3 of Britain's entire population at the time, visited the exposition. Its almost £200,000 profit was used to open the Victorian and Albert Museum, Science Museum, and Natural History Museum, which of course was housed in the gigantic Gothic-looking palaces in the area that became known as Albertopolis. The Crystal Palace was later moved in 1854 to Sydenham Hill in South London. The building was destroyed by fire on 30 November 1936. That will be a recurring theme. Great building built in record time for exhibition, often burned in fire afterwards, and then destroyed. So successful was the Great Exhibition that England had another one starting on May 1, 1862. But no need to use the Crystal Palace again. Might as well build another, the new building at the Horticultural Society. This one, which covered 23 acres and consisted of 2 immense domes, each larger than St. Peter's. Between the domes was a central avenue to see all the 28,600 exhibits and galleries. New York, 1853. While not classified as a World's Fair, the exhibition of the industry of all nations, known as the New York Crystal Palace Exhibition, was held at Bryant Park in 1853-54 in an iron and glass structure similar to the one in England. A 100-foot diameter dome topped it. It seems odd that the first 2 World Fairs both had similar buildings named the Crystal Palace. Of course, this building also burned down on October 5, 1858. Unlike London, the Crystal Palace Fair of New York lost a lot of money. When it burned down, a newspaper reported, "So bursts a bubble rather noteworthy in the annals of New York." To be accurate, the bubble burst some years ago, and this catastrophe merely annihilates the apparatus that generated it. Another Crystal Palace was built in Munich in 1854 for its exhibition. It was called the Glass Palace. It lasted until 1931, when, you guessed it, a fire destroyed it. Then there was the Crystal Palace in Montreal, built for its 1860 exhibition. It later included an ice rink inside during the winter, housing one of the world's first hockey teams. It burned down in 1880. Toronto had a Crystal Palace as well, a giant building built in 1878 for its annual Canadian Industrial Exhibition. It too would be destroyed by fire in 1906. 5 Crystal Palace buildings, all destroyed in somewhat odd circumstances. I'm sure there are more if one just digs into the worldwide Crystal Palace phenomena of building and fire. The people who put these fairs on really believed that they were involved in some great upbringing of humanity, from primitive savages to good Victorian industrial Christians. Take this from Frank Morton Todd, writing just after the San Francisco Fair of 1915. Expositions are not fairs, and the merchandising element in them is merely part of their financial support. They are what the name connotates: displays, demonstrations, vast exemplifications of the works of man, self-conscious and intelligently directed. They are very modern. If those diligent merchants and manufacturers, the classic Greeks, had held them, we should have had to exclaim, "What a marvelous people to devise such an agency of progress." Read the chapter on a single-handed clock and boiling eggs, and then you'll understand how the exposition serves and speeds up human development. It is better to have the planned effects of one exposition than the accidental benefits of 40 wars. End quote. This message of the exposition, actually being a part of human progress and not a reflection of it, was common in these book overviews. They really believed that the fairs of the day were evolving the world. Fairs prior to World War I are called industrial fairs, as they had a focus of technology and industry. Yet underlying all of this was the idea of the advancement of the Western world over primitive societies. For these early fairs, the anthropology exhibits, basically natives shown off with their huts or teepees in a sort of zoo, were as much a feature of the fairs as the manufacturing exhibits or carnival attractions. The first fair to take this to the extreme was the Philadelphia Exhibition of 1876. In different ways, all of those fairs supported the proposition that the advance of the American industrial complex, as directed by an Anglo-Saxon elite, was synonymous with national progress. Robert Rydell. The first true World Fair in the United States was the Philadelphia Exhibition of 1876, to celebrate the 100th anniversary of U.S. independence. At least that is how it liked to be known. But its official title at the time was the International Exhibition of Arts, Manufactures, and the Products of the Soil and Mine. I am never fully sure how art and manufacture goes together with soil and mine, both of which would never make the title of any future exhibition, and independence. Again, the Study Love site has links to several books of this fair, and I recommend The Centennial Portfolio, a souvenir of the International Exhibition by Thomas Westcote, which provides original drawings of all the buildings. Just for that, it is a spectacular document. Right after the U.S. Civil War came a focus of big money capitalists who invented in the new industries of railroads, telegraphs, and steelmaking. It was these new rich elite who were the ones to fund these fairs. The wealthy supporters of world fairs were interested not only in showing off their private wealth in a medium that they thought would help rebuild, literally reconstruct the American nation after the Civil War, and to propagate a particular view of the world that insisted on the presumed fact of Anglo-Saxon superiority as a way to unite whites regardless of social class at the expense of people defined racially as others. A website named Free Library of Philadelphia has over 800 drawings and photographs of this exposition, and the construction photos are very telling in most cases. For unlike what we will see with the construction photos of other exhibitions, here are some large inner wooden frames, providing that some of the buildings were in fact temporary structures. However, there are problems with many of the buildings, such as the Memorial Hall, the one building that made it through the fair, where the construction photo was more like what we will see in future expos, that of a fully completed lower structure, some scaffolding, and work being done on an upper dome. It is the first photo of what becomes standard, photographs of completed lower levels surrounded by scaffolding. The Philadelphia Exposition covered 285 acres and was constructed in what became the very standard 2-year time frame. This fair occurred only 10 years after the end of the Civil War, in a country supposedly rebuilding from all the damage, destruction, and death of it. The main building was over 870,000 square feet. That is more than a third of a mile in length, similar to the Crystal Palace in London. It also included 4 75-foot-high towers with almost 700 columns. Unlike London, which had only one main building, at Philadelphia there was more. There was Machinery Hall, with over 500,000 square feet of space, Agricultural Hall that looked like cathedrals placed together. Above each entrance was a beautiful set of rose windows. Of all the buildings in Philadelphia, only Memorial Hall, 210 by 365 feet, still survives. It has a granite exterior and a 150-foot-high dome. On top of the dome is a statue of Columbia, who we will see the importance of in the chapter on the Columbia exhibition. The question we continue to ask is, why build such large buildings only to quickly tear them down when the expositions end? But more was destroyed than just the exposition itself. Research presented on the site Stolen History found that there were 6 giant hotels built next to the exposition. They included the brick Grand Exposition Hotel, 1,325 rooms, and the Globe Hotel, which had 1,000 rooms. However, the site provides a very shocking revelation by stating all the hotels built for the exposition were demolished soon after its conclusion, except the United States Hotel, which survived into the 1970s. This comment is exactly why I wrote this book. It's one thing to build some fair buildings and then tear them down. That's insane enough. But to also build a number of brick and stone hotels and then tear them down as well is beyond insane. Why would you not keep a few around and see if any of them still get guests? Or does the city think that no one will ever want to visit Philadelphia again? The Smithsonian took control of the new anthropological exhibits, and part of their job was to present the native Indians as savage primates compared to the civilized white Americans. These exhibits helped to provide the rationalization for the extreme violence taking place on the plains. This was the time of the final Indian Wars, where entire villages were being massacred and the buffalo slaughtered to near extinction, and germ warfare employed as diseases such as smallpox were sent in on infected blankets. It would be this summer, during the fair, that George Custer's 7th Cavalry would suffer a complete defeat at the Little Bighorn, which would create a call to finish off the savages once and for all. While there was a woman's building, Susan B. Anthony felt this was nowhere near enough to help the unequal status of women, who could not vote, and on July 4 shocked the U.S. Vice President at the fair by handing him a scroll containing the Declaration of Rights of Women. African Americans were offered no space at the fair, and in fact were not given any jobs, even those considered menial. This was to be a fair for white people by white people. I wish you could see the bird's eye diagram, 1876, of the Philadelphia Fair in detail. It can be seen in various online versions. Follow the footnote. Zoom in close. Not only can you see the colossal buildings of the exposition on the left side, when you look at the main city of Philadelphia, it's more like Florence. There's a mini Colosseum, giant domes and spires, and in the center is the building that looks exactly like the Parthenon. Again, who was building this in less than 100 years that the city was in existence, and to this scale and appearance? Also look on the hill above the exhibition grounds. You will see a tower structure with a ball on top. It looks exactly like a Tesla tower. So were they using Tesla-free energy technology in 1876 to power this fair? However, the fair was a failure financially, as were most of the previous world fairs with the exception of London. The total cost for Philadelphia was $8 million, and the receipts were $4,300,000. Bancroft wrote in his book, even with the money loss, "It is not, however, on the basis of dollars and cents that the success of such an effort can be estimated." He is claiming that the fairs are losing a lot of money, but that it's not a big deal. So why are they having them? We know that rich people like most is staying rich. They don't like dropping their money into things that lose money and keep losing money. Thus, the fairs cannot be about money at all, but as Bancroft states, it's not on the basis of dollars and cents that success is estimated. The question then becomes, what is? I believe it is to rewrite the complete historical narrative, to prop up the new white ruling elite, which I'm not sure existed prior to 1800, and to destroy all of the old vestiges of the great civilizations that spanned the globe prior to the arrival of the new conquerors. For that, we have to look at some very specific buildings supposedly built for some of the fairs. Strange buildings. First is the Hotel Internacional, or Grand Hotel Internacional, that was supposed to have been built for the Universal Exposition of Barcelona in 1888. The hotel was 5,000 square meters, had capacity for 2,000 guests in 600 rooms and 30 apartments. According to the history sources, it was built in a record time of 53 days. The construction began in the middle of December 1887, and the exterior was completed by February 14, 1888. The complete interior finishes is what required work until March. In the middle of January, it was decided to work at night, using 18 large electric lights so the 650 masons, 100 carpenters, and 40 plasterers could work around the clock. Like all of these amazing expo buildings, it was a temporary facility to welcome visitors to the exposition and was demolished once the fair was over. Supposedly modeled on the Ritz Hotel in Switzerland, it was obviously meant to cater to high-end guests. Look at the scale of the building. It's giant, all of it covered with fine ornamentation. If you were going to build a temporary structure to tear down in a year, would you really go to all the trouble for a superfine finish on the exterior? No, of course not. You simplify the build. You don't sculpt every square inch of the Duomo in Florence unless you expect the building to be there for centuries. I asked a building contractor friend how long it would take to build this today with modern machines. He said it would be hard because of the ornamentation, but that likely it would take just over 2 years. Today, with modern machines, requires 2 years, but with horse, wagon, and hand screwdrivers was 53 days. What makes the Standard story even more unbelievable is that it is claimed to have had no foundation, but placed on a metal structure to provide stability for the temporary building. Really? No foundation? Do you really want 6,000 guests, particularly the rich elite of Europe, coming to stay and then die in your collapsed, unsafe building? Come on, it's not even conceivable. And the hotel, and if the hotel is built that strongly, why the hell would you tear it down just a year later, on the date of May the 1st? My guess is that the work crew did not build anything. They were working on refurbishing a building that was already there. Perhaps they altered a few things, added a few things, and repainted it to look fresh. They did a major upgrade to it, which is conceivable to do in 53 days. Next, we look at the city of Louisville, Kentucky, which had the large regional exhibition beginning in 1883. Look at the size of the building in the center. It was a 2-story wooden and glass structure designed by McDonald Brothers that covered approximately 12 acres or 3 square blocks of the city. It was bigger than the Medici palaces of Florence. The above drawing shows 4 interior courtyards with fountains that would have provided light and ventilation within the building. It was also decked out with the largest installation of incandescent light bulbs, having been recently invented by Thomas Edison, a previous resident of Louisville, and the fair had more incandescent lamps than all of New York City. When the year's fairs ended by 1889, the building was torn down and then used to build a small theater close by. Why tear down such a thing? You could easily have some of the most beautiful apartments anywhere. The story lingering with the historians again is that the building was somehow temporary. But how temporary can a building be if you're going to use it for 5 years in a row, and then use the very building materials to build another building? Or maybe it really wasn't temporary. The city of Louisville is supposed to be founded in 1778 during the American Revolution. Yes, in the middle of the Great War of Independence, founding a new city was considered a good idea. That sounds odd. 80 civilians and 150 soldiers were said to have gone there to start it. Are we really to believe that in 100 years they went from log cabins to that? Now, perhaps they did, but it really needs to be examined further as to how the material was quarried, transported, and raised in a place with no roads, trucks, or machines. Recall the word founded is actually two combined words, found and dead. And most U.S. cities were founded in the period 1700 to 1850. More bizarre are cities like Salt Lake City, supposedly founded by Mormon pioneers in 1850, or San Francisco by Gold Rush cowboys in 1847. Yet in 20 years, those cities have cathedrals, palaces, towers, and domes that would rival Cologne or Prague. Cowboys and soldiers in 20 years recreated old Europe? The story is the same for almost every North American city, be it Toronto or Indianapolis. At the New Orleans Cotton Fair of 1884, the Smithsonian set up a presentation that all races were symbolic of a human lifespan, and that the blacks and the natives were at the children's stage while the whites were in the adult stages. They also set up comparisons of native skulls and the skulls of criminals, which were presented as small, thus similar, compared to the large skulls presented of white people. Early fairs, when they did present exhibits on American blacks, it was to show how good of agriculture and industrial workers they were, not that there should be any social equality for them. I have footnoted the front piece of the book by Buell on anthropology because of what the description of the image he placed there represents. The photogravure herein is from an excellent specially prepared drawing, which very accurately illustrates, as nearly as the science of ethnology is able to, the characteristic types of mankind arranged in progressive order of development from primitive or prehistoric man to the highest example of modern civilization. The two central figures are symbolical, representing intelligence with the torch of enlightenment and the book of wisdom, invading the darksome cave in which ignorance sulks and skulls in companionship with bird of evil omen and superstition. It is aspiration lighting the dungeon of savagery and directing the race to better conditions, moral, intellectual, and social. This pretty much sums up the attitude of the Western nations to the rest of the world at the time, much of which continues to this day. So how about Australia? That is another country with a recent European founding. It has the same story. Within less than 50 years, a group of soldiers and convicts have created a massive building program. Take the Garden Palace for the 1879 Sydney International Exhibition. It was designed by James Barnett and constructed by John Young, who helped build the London Crystal Palace. What luck! The dome was 100 feet in diameter and 210 feet high. The building had a floor space of over 112,000 meters. The palace cost £191,000 and was completed in 8 months. The reason given for the quick build was due to import of electric lighting from England, which allowed work to happen 24 hours a day. Instead of this looking like the Crystal Palace, it was created to be that of a large cathedral, which included towers and giant central dome. Surprise, surprise. And it was destroyed by a fire on September 22, 1882. Melbourne had their international exhibition a year later and used many of the same events as Sydney. Their Royal Exhibition building was built in the Victoria Gardens, and for some odd reason, this building was not temporary. It was kept and used again for an exhibition in 1888, and parts of it still remain today in a World Heritage Exposition building. Once again, one has to wonder how recently arrived convicts with little building skills or tools were able to construct incredible things in record time. Look up the list of what was built in Christchurch, New Zealand, 1851 to 1853, for example, where 300 inhabitants, mostly women and children, build massive structures like cathedrals. Before moving on, I must make mention of the International Exhibition of Paris in 1889. So vast was the scale, and yet so artistic the design, that it became the wonder of the civilized nations of Earth. And by all it was conceded to be that never before had been witnessed such a combination of the grand and beautiful in science, art, and industry. Interspersed among the main structures were groups representing foreign lands, a street in Algiers, a Turkish village, the minarets of Tunis, and the dwellings of New Caledonia. While art galleries formed one of the most interesting features of this effort, it surpassed, as I have said, all its predecessors as the great industrial exposition, with its larger scope and variety of exhibits that had ever before portrayed the phases of human industry. There were probably but few who could examine, and fewer still who could appreciate this in its entirety, the treasures and attractions of this grand spectacular display. To make the circuit merely of the grounds and buildings, the former occupying 173 and the latter 75 acres, required a journey of 15 miles, and to form an intelligent estimate of their contents needed months of close observation and study. Bancroft. Recall that this fair happened just 18 years after much of Paris was supposedly destroyed in 1871 by the Germans during the Franco-Prussian War. The great building of this fair was the Eiffel Tower, 894 feet in height, still one of the attractions of Paris. However, it does not now look like it did when it was first built. In early construction photos, what can be seen are some rounded structures along the first level. These could be seen in photos taken during the 1900 exposition as well. Then a decade later, they vanish. So what are these? They were part of the original design, so I removed them. I think they may have been part of making the tower into its full original purpose, as part of an energy-generating device. A device that for some reason, after the World Fairs, was shut off. I will discuss towers for energy in the upcoming chapters. But we must look ahead to the great expositions after Paris, and the cities that held them. To recall where this investigation is headed, A. Were the buildings already there from long before and just needed to be refurbished or restored, or B. That there was a technology at the time that was not reported or believed, one we may be just rediscovering today.